Everyone in that room stared at her, some with confusion, some with irritation, most with quiet disgust. She didn't look like she belonged. Her coat was faded, her shoes were worn, her hands trembled as she clutched a small handbag to her chest. And when she finally spoke, the billionaire laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward one, a confident laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from power. What he didn't know was that humiliating her in public would cost him everything he had built. And by the end of the night, the same man who laughed the loudest would be begging her to forgive him. Her name was Clara Bennett. She stood near the entrance of the grand ballroom, unsure where to place herself. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors. Men in tailored suits spoke in confident tones. Women in elegant gowns smiled politely, holding glasses that cost more than Clara's monthly rent. This was not her world. This was the annual Harrington Foundation Gala, a night where the wealthy gathered to celebrate generosity. But Clara knew the truth. This event wasn't about helping people. It was about images, reputations, power, and at the center of it all was Richard Harrington, a billionaire, a self-made legend, a man praised by the media as a genius with a heart of gold. Clara watched him from a distance, watched the way people leaned in when he spoke, watched the way laughter followed his jokes, watched the respect, almost fear, in their eyes. Her heartbeat grew louder in her ears. Not from fear, from memory. She hadn't come here to be seen. She had come because this was the first place she could no longer stay invisible. Her name was Clara Bennett. She stood near the heavy oak entrance of the grand ballroom, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of her coat. She felt like a ghost haunting a palace. Everywhere she looked, there was wealth so blinding it felt aggressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars, spilling golden light across polished marble floors that reflected the jewelry of the guests. Men in tailored suits, worth more than a year of Clara's salary, spoke in low, confident tones about stocks, mergers, and offshore accounts. Women in elegant silk gowns smiled politely, their laughter tinkling like the expensive crystal glasses they held. Glasses filled with vintage champagne that cost more than Clara's monthly rent. This was not her world. To them, she was invisible, a glitch in their perfect, expensive reality. This was the annual Harrington Foundation Gala. On the surface, it was a night where the elite gathered to celebrate generosity and giving back. Large banners reminded everyone of the millions being raised for the poor. But Clara knew the truth behind the silk and the smiles. This event wasn't about helping people. It was a masquerade, a carefully choreographed play about images, reputations, and, above all, power. Each donation was just a payment for a cleaner conscience. And at the center of this orbit was the sun they all revolved around. Richard Harrington, a billionaire, a self-made legend, a man the media called a modern saint with a heart of gold. From where Clara stood, he looked perfect. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his smile was warm, and his eyes seemed to sparkle with genuine kindness as he shook hands with senators and CEOs. Clara watched him from the shadows of a marble pillar. She watched the way people leaned in when he spoke, desperate for a crumb of his attention. She watched the way rehearsed laughter followed his every joke. She saw the respect in their eyes. But if you looked closer, you could see the fear of being cast out of his circle. Her heartbeat grew louder in her ears, a rhythmic thumping that drowned out the soft violin music playing in the background. It wasn't the thumping of fear. It was the heavy, steady beat of memory. She remembered a time when the Harrington name didn't mean power. It meant betrayal. She remembered the cold nights, the legal threats, and the way her mother's spirit had slowly withered under the weight of Richard's success. She hadn't come here to beg. She hadn't come here to be seen by the cameras or to eat the expensive hors d'oeuvres. She had come because this was the first place and the last night where she could no longer afford to stay invisible. The truth had been buried for 20 years, and tonight, Clara was going to dig it up in front of everyone. Richard stepped onto the stage with the effortless grace of a king entering his court. The moment his polished shoes touched the platform, the room erupted in a wave of thunderous applause. Men stood up and women cheered, their faces glowing with admiration for the man who seemingly had it all. Richard didn't bask in it immediately. Instead, he smiled warmly, lowering his head and raising a hand modestly, as if he were truly embarrassed by such a grand display of affection. "Please, please," he said, his voice smooth as silk through the high-end speakers. "Tonight isn't about me. It's about something much bigger." The room settled into a respectful silence. Richard leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium, making eye contact with the front rows. "Tonight," he began, his tone dropping to a whisper of feigned humility, "is about gratitude." More applause rippled through the ballroom. He began to speak about community. He painted a picture of a world where those with much look out for those with little. He spoke about opportunity, how every person, no matter their background, deserved a chance to rise. He spoke about how success, real success, only meant something if it was used to lift others up. Clara stood in the back, her shadow long against the marble. She listened quietly, every word feeling like a needle under her skin. Every sentence Richard uttered felt rehearsed. Every pause for dramatic effect was calculated. It was perfect, too perfect. As he spoke, Clara's mind drifted back 20 years. She didn't see the saint of the city on that stage. She remembered a different man, a colder man, a man who sat behind a massive mahogany desk, casually signing away her mother's life's work with a flick of a gold-plated pen. She remembered the man who made decisions behind closed doors, decisions that crushed small families to build massive empires, and then never once looked back to see the wreckage he left behind. To give, Richard's voice boomed, bringing Clara back to the present, is not a choice for people like us. It's a responsibility we carry for the sake of the future. The applause this time was deafening, a roar of approval from the elite who felt validated by his words. Clara swallowed hard, the lump in her throat feeling like lead. Her fingers tightened around the worn, frayed strap of her bag, until her knuckles turned white. Inside that bag was the evidence of his lies. The cold, hard proof that the man everyone trusted was a thief in a $1,000 suit. She looked at the stage one last time, her fear finally dissolving into a cold, sharp clarity. The mask was beautiful, but it was time for the world to see the face underneath. As Richard's speech concluded, the ballroom seemed to vibrate with the lingering energy of his words. The host, a woman dressed in a shimmering silver gown, stepped back to the microphone, her smile radiant and professional. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington, for those inspiring words," she beamed. "In the spirit of tonight's theme, we'd now like to invite a few guests to the stage to share a short message about how the Harrington Foundation has touched their lives." A few people stepped forward from the front rows. They were carefully chosen speakers, CEOs of partner charities and local politicians. They spoke with polished words and practiced gestures, telling safe, heartwarming stories that only served to polish Richard's crown. Each story was a perfect brick in the wall of his reputation. But then, as the last scheduled speaker stepped down, there was a pause. It was an awkward silence, a small gap in the carefully scripted evening. The host looked toward the wings of the stage, expecting the next VIP. But no one appeared. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. Before the host could fill the silence, a movement at the back of the room caught everyone's eye. Clara stepped forward. She didn't rush. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace that commanded attention. The click of her worn shoes on the marble floor seemed to echo louder than the orchestra. Whispers rippled across the room like a cold wind. The elite guests turned in their seats, their faces twisting with judgment. "Who is she?" one woman hissed, clutching her pearls. "Is she lost? Look at that coat," whispered another. "Where is security? Did they even check her invitation?" A man in the front row muttered, looking toward the guards. Clara ignored them all. Her eyes were locked on Richard, who was standing at the edge of the stage, a look of confused amusement beginning to form on his face. She reached the microphone. Up close, the lights were blinding, making her faded clothes look even more out of place against the gold leaf decor. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, hardly more than a whisper. But it was steady. It had a weight to it that silenced the whispers in an instant. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly into the eyes of the billionaire. "I need to speak with you, not as a guest and not as a charity case, but as the person you've spent 20 years trying to forget." The entire room went still. Even the waiters stopped moving. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Richard stood there for a moment, looking at Clara, as if she were a strange insect that had flown into his wine glass. He tilted his head, a smirk of amused condescension spreading across his face. He adjusted his silk tie, looking out at the crowd to share the joke with them. "My dear woman," he said lightly, his voice dripping with fake patience, "I'm afraid this isn't the right time or the place for whatever this is." Clara didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes burning with a fire that seemed to unsettle the billionaire for just a fraction of a second. "I won't take long," she replied, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. Suddenly, Richard laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was loud, harsh and cruel. The sound echoed across the vast ballroom, bouncing off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. It was the laugh of a man who believed he was untouchable, a man who thought that money made him a god. "Look around you," Richard said, gesturing to the men in tuxedos and women in diamonds. "This is a private event, a high-stakes evening for people who build the world, and as much as I admire your courage, I don't usually conduct charity cases on stage. If you're looking for a handout, there's a line at the back of the building for that." A ripple of sycophantic laughter followed his lead. A few guests chuckled, eager to please the man in power. Others, however, looked away, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something far darker was unfolding. Richard took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper that the microphone still caught. "You don't belong here," he added, his eyes narrowing. "You're a smudge on a perfect evening. Security will be here in a moment to help you find the exit. I suggest you go quietly before things get embarrassing for you." Clara felt her face burn with a mixture of shame and boiling rage. She could feel 1,000 eyes judging her, mocking her faded coat and worn shoes. But she stayed exactly where she was. "I didn't come here for your money, Richard," she said quietly, but with a force that made the room go silent again. Richard raised an eyebrow, a mocking glint in his eye. He crossed his arms over his expensive chest, looking at her with bored curiosity. "Oh," he asked, a sneer curling his lip. "No money, no job request, no sob story. Then why on earth are you here, wasting my time and ruining my gala?" Clara lifted her head, her chin high, meeting Richard's mocking gaze with a cold, piercing intensity that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. "I'm here," she said, her voice projecting to the very back of the hall, Because Harrington Industries wasn't built on your genius alone. It was built on a foundation you buried 20 years ago, hoping it would never see the light of day. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The mocking whispers died down, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable tension. The guests, once amused, now leaned forward, their faces etched with a new kind of curiosity. Richard's smug smile faded slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting quickly toward his head of security who was standing near the stage. "I don't know who you are or what kind of delusional game you're playing," Richard said, his tone no longer light. It was hard and defensive. "And I certainly don't appreciate baseless accusations at my own gala. This performance is over." Clara nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile appearing on her lips. It was a look of someone who held all the cards. "I didn't expect you to recognize me," she replied calmly. "To you, I was just a child in the background, a minor detail in a major transaction. But you knew my mother. You knew her very well." Silence fell over the ballroom, a silence so absolute you could hear the faint hum of the stage lights. Richard's jaw tightened, a small muscle pulsing in his neck. His composed mask was starting to crack. "I have met thousands of people over the course of my career," he said, trying to regain his commanding tone. "Names fade, faces blur. If your mother was an employee, I suggest you take this up with Human Resources on Monday." "My mother's name didn't fade in your memory, Richard. It was the name you spent a fortune in legal fees to erase," Clara said, her voice rising in power. "She didn't just work for you. She was the one who signed the original patent papers. She was the architect of the technology that made you a billionaire, and you didn't just fire her, you stole from her." The air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Richard looked as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time that night, no words came out. The saint of the city was starting to look like a man caught in a lie. 25 years ago, the empire you see today was nothing more than a shared dream in a cramped two-bedroom apartment. Clara began, her voice echoing with the weight of decades. "The world knows the name Richard Harrington, but they've never heard of Clara Bennett, my mother. She wasn't just an employee, Richard. She was the architect. While you were out charm offensive, securing the handshakes, she was the one at the desk until 3 a.m., mapping out the financial algorithms that would eventually disrupt the entire industry. She was a woman of quiet brilliance, meticulous, dedicated, and perhaps too trusting. She didn't care for the red carpets or the gala invitations. She cared for the math. She cared for the vision. She believed in the partnership you both had built. She saw you as a brother in arms, a man who shared her dream of changing the world for the better. But as the company began to explode in value, as the millions turned into billions, the saint of the city started to change. You didn't see a partner anymore. You saw a liability, someone who knew the secrets you wanted to claim as your own, someone whose name on the patent papers was a reminder that you weren't the sole genius. I remember the nights she would come home crying, her hands shaking as she held legal documents she didn't understand. New investors had arrived, men in sharp suits who looked at her like she was a stain on their pristine carpet. Lawyers started rewriting agreements, using terminology designed to trap a woman whose only crime was focused on her work instead of the fine print. One rainy Tuesday, it all came to an end. After 15 years of building Harrington Industries from the dirt up, she was called into a cold, glass-walled office. Your office. You didn't offer her a chair. You didn't even look her in the eye. You just pushed a folder across the desk. A restructuring plan, you called it. It was a systematic execution of her legacy. Her shares, her voting rights, her name, all gone with a single signature. When she tried to protest, when she spoke of the promises made in that small apartment, you threatened her. You told her that Harrington Industries had moved beyond her. You offered her a settlement, a pittance compared to the billions she helped earn, on one condition: total silence, an NDA, so strict she couldn't even tell her own daughter why we were suddenly losing our home. She didn't sign because she wanted the money. She signed because she was dying. The stress, the betrayal, it had triggered an illness her body couldn't fight. She didn't have the years left to spend in a courtroom. She chose to use her final months to raise me, to make sure I was okay, rather than wasting her remaining breath, fighting a man who had already stolen her soul. She died in a rented room, watching you on a flat-screen TV being handed Visionary of the Year awards. She died believing that the truth had been buried under so much gold that no one would ever find it. She died thinking her life's work would forever bear the name of the man who stabbed her in the back. Clara took a step toward Richard, the silence in the ballroom now deafening. But she made one mistake, Richard. She forgot that she raised me. And she forgot that truth has a funny way of surviving, even in the dark. The silence in the ballroom was no longer respectful. It was suffocating. Clara didn't rush. She knew that every eye in the room and every camera on the press wall was locked onto her. She slowly reached into her worn leather bag, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. From the back, she looked like a helpless woman, but up close, she had the presence of an executioner. She pulled out a thin, weathered blue folder. To anyone else, it looked like trash. To Richard Harrington, it looked like a death warrant. With a steady hand, Clara stepped onto the stage, the very stage Richard had claimed as his throne, and placed the folder on the mahogany table beside the podium. You told everyone tonight that this foundation was built on gratitude and opportunity, Clara said, her voice amplified by the microphone, echoing like thunder. But these papers tell a different story. These are the original incorporation contracts from 25 years ago, not the doctored versions your lawyers filed in the public records. These are the ones with the original wet ink signatures. She opened the folder. The cameras zoomed in. On the big screens behind the stage, the documents appeared. There, in faded ink, was the name Clara Bennett, alongside Richard Harrington. But it wasn't a 50-50 split. The documents clearly showed Clara Bennett as the primary intellectual property owner, with a clawback clause that triggered if any partner attempted a hostile takeover or fraudulent restructuring. Richard's face, usually a mask of tanned perfection, turned a sickly shade of gray. "Those are forgeries," he hissed, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Security, I told you to remove her. Now!" But the security guards didn't move. They, like everyone else, were mesmerized by the unfolding disaster. The investors in the front row, men who had billions tied up in Harrington Industries, were already leaning in, their faces pale as they realized the legal nightmare they were about to enter. "I'm not finished," Clara said, her voice rising with a cold, sharp power. From the same bag, she pulled out a small silver USB drive. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, the metal glinting under the crystal chandeliers. "Inside this folder are the papers you stole. But on this drive is the digital ghost of your crimes. My mother was meticulous, Richard. She knew you were a snake before you even knew it yourself. She kept logs. Every private email, every recorded phone call where you discussed squeezing her out, every transaction where you diverted funds to offshore accounts to make the company look broke before the restructuring." A frantic energy swept through the room. Phones began to rise like a sea of digital fireflies. Reporters were frantically typing on their laptops. The stock price of Harrington Industries was likely crashing in the after-hours market at this very moment. Richard stepped back, his heel catching on the edge of the carpet. He looked small. For the first time in his life, The billionaire looked like a cornered thief. He leaned in, his voice a low, desperate growl that only the front rows could hear. "You don't understand what you're doing, Clara. You'll destroy everything. Thousands of jobs, the foundation, the charity. If you do this, everyone loses." Clara looked at him, and for a moment she didn't see a powerful man. She saw the coward who had let her mother die in poverty. "Oh, I understand perfectly, Richard," she replied, her words cutting like a knife. "I'm not destroying the company. I'm simply reclaiming the house from the man who broke into it." She turned back to the audience, holding the blue folder high. According to the original bylaws of this foundation, bylaws that were never legally dissolved, fraudulent activity by a minority partner results in an immediate forfeiture of all assets to the primary stakeholder's estate. She paused, letting the weight of the statement sink in. As Clara Bennett's sole heir, these documents and this evidence make me the legal majority stakeholder of Harrington Industries and this foundation. Starting tonight, you are no longer the owner of this building, this company, or even that suit you're wearing. The room exploded. It wasn't just noise. It was a sonic boom of gasps, shouts, and the frantic clicking of shutters. The elite, the powerful, the wealthy, they were all witnessing the fall of a titan. Richard Harrington, the man who had laughed so loudly at a poor woman only minutes ago, was now a man with nothing but the truth staring him in the face. The transformation of Richard Harrington was unlike anything the elite of the city had ever witnessed. It was as if the very air was being sucked out of his lungs. His face, once glowing with the radiance of success and expensive skincare, drained of all color, turning a haunting, ghostly gray. The arrogant tilt of his head was gone. His shoulders slumped as the weight of 25 years of lies finally crashed down upon him. Around him, the ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had turned into a war room. Investors who had just moments ago been laughing at his jokes were now huddled in dark corners, their faces pale, whispering frantically into their phones. The saint of the city was now a toxic asset. Lawyers in the room, men who were paid thousands of dollars an hour to protect reputations, were making urgent, hushed calls. They weren't calling to help Richard. They were calling to save themselves, to distance their firms from the inevitable legal explosion that Clara Bennett had just detonated. Richard stepped forward, stumbling slightly. The confidence that had defined him for decades had vanished. He leaned in toward Clara, his eyes wide and bloodshot, looking like a man drowning in shallow water. "Clara, please," he whispered, his voice cracking, the polished baritone now replaced by a desperate rasp. "We don't need to do this here, not in front of them. This is a business matter. It can be handled privately, in a boardroom, not on a stage." Clara didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her expression remained as cold and unyielding as the marble floor beneath her feet. Richard grew more frantic. He reached out as if to grab her sleeve, but pulled back at the last second. "I can make this right. Whatever you want. Money? You want money. Name your price. 10 million, 50, 100. I'll write the check right now. We can call this a misunderstanding, and you can walk out of here a wealthy woman. Just stop the screens. Tell them it was a mistake." The room went silent again as they waited for Clara's response. $100 million. A life of luxury for someone who arrived in a faded coat. But Clara didn't look tempted. She looked disgusted. She leaned into the microphone one last time, making sure every person in the room heard the final nail in the coffin of Richard Harrington's empire. "You still don't understand, do you, Richard?" she said, her voice dripping with a calm, terrifying authority. "You think everyone has a price because you sold your soul a long time ago. You think money can buy silence just like it bought my mother's life. But you're wrong. She took a step closer, forcing him to look her in the eye. I didn't come here to negotiate with a thief. I didn't come here to fill my pockets with your blood money. I didn't come for a settlement or a payout. She paused, then spoke the words that would be headlined in every newspaper the next morning. I came to correct a lie. I came to take back the name you stole. My mother died in a rented room while you lived in a palace built on her mind. Tonight, the palace belongs to the truth, and the truth doesn't negotiate. She turned her back on him, leaving the billionaire standing alone on his stage, surrounded by the ruins of a life built on sand. Richard Harrington, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. The silence that followed Clara's refusal was heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the ballroom. Richard Harrington, a man who had commanded boardrooms and influenced national policies, looked like a hollow shell. His voice, when he finally found it, didn't sound like his own. It was a thin, high-pitched crack, the sound of a man who had lost his soul before he lost his money. "Please," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically from Clara to the high-ranking officials in the audience. "Clara, listen to reason. You don't know what this will do. You're talking about destroying a pillar of the economy. You're talking about thousands of employees, global markets, the Harrington legacy. It will all burn. You're inviting chaos." He reached out, his hand trembling, pleading with the woman he had called a charity case just moments ago. He was no longer a billionaire. He was a beggar in a tuxedo. Clara looked at him, not with the rage he expected, but with a profound, quiet sadness. She saw the fear in his eyes, but it wasn't the fear of a man who regretted his sins. It was the fear of a man who regretted being caught. "I do know what this will do, Richard," she said softly, her voice carrying a calm that was far more terrifying than a scream. "It will dismantle a lie. It will tear down a castle built on stolen dreams. It will do exactly what justice should have done 25 years ago when my mother walked out of your office with nothing but her dignity." She took a long, final look at the man who had destroyed her family's life. "You think the world will end because you are no longer in control of it. But the world will go on. The employees will find a leader who values them. The company will find a name that isn't stained. The only thing ending tonight is you." Without waiting for another word, Clara turned away from the stage. She didn't run, and she didn't look back to see the security guards finally stepping toward Richard, not to protect him, but to escort him into a reality he had spent a lifetime avoiding. She walked with a steady, rhythmic pace. She walked past the crystal chandeliers that no longer seemed so bright. She walked past the flashing cameras of the paparazzi, who were now pushing past each other to get a shot of the new majority stakeholder of Harrington Industries. She walked past the elite guests, the men in suits and women in diamonds who had laughed at her faded coat. Now they stood aside, creating a wide path for her, their faces filled with a mixture of shock, fear, and a new, unearned respect. No one stopped her. No one dared to speak. The only sound in the massive hall was the steady, confident click of her worn shoes on the marble floor. It was the sound of a debt being paid in full. As she pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the cool night air, she took the first breath of a woman who was finally, truly free. As the heavy doors of the Harrington ballroom swung shut behind Clara, the world she left inside began to dissolve. Within minutes, the digital age did what it does best. It spread the truth like wildfire. That night, the headlines across every news portal, every social media feed, and every midnight broadcast changed instantly. The saint of the city was gone. In his place was a man whose name was now synonymous with betrayal and theft. By dawn, the stock market had delivered its own verdict, as billions in market value evaporated from Harrington Industries. Reputations that had been built over decades, through expensive PR firms and carefully staged charity events, were incinerated in a single hour of truth. The investors who once clamored for Richard's attention were now erasing his name from their contact lists. The power he thought was absolute turned out to be nothing more than small. As the city lights flickered in the distance, one truth became impossible to ignore. A truth that resonated far beyond the marble walls of that gala. It was a lesson for the powerful who think they are untouchable, and for the quiet who think they are forgotten. It is the oldest lesson in human history. Never judge someone by how they look when they enter a room. We are a society obsessed with the surface, the tailored suits, the polished shoes, the confident smiles. We often mistake wealth for wisdom and power for character. We look at a faded coat and see a charity case. We look at trembling hands and see weakness. But Clara Bennett showed the world that true power doesn't need a tuxedo or a stage. True power resides in the quiet integrity of those who wait, those who remember, and those who carry the weight of justice in a simple leather bag. The story of the billionaire and the poor woman isn't just a story about a company or a stolen patent. It's a warning, a reminder that every room you enter, there is someone you might be overlooking, someone who doesn't fit in, someone who seems invisible. Be careful how you treat the ones you think have nothing, because the quietest person in the room may be carrying a truth so heavy it can sink an empire. They may be holding the keys to a past you tried to bury, and the power to take everything from you. As Clara walked into the shadows of the city, she didn't just take back a company. She restored a name. And she left the world with a chilling reminder. The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to wait for its time to speak. If Clara's journey touched your heart today, please give this video a like. Your support helps us bring more of these life-changing stories to light. If you haven't joined our community yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. By joining us, you'll never miss a moment of the dramatic and meaningful stories we share every week. What did you learn from today's story, and what would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one of them. Thank you for watching, and for being a part of our journey. Stay strong, stay truthful, and we will see you in the next story.